Welcome, welcome. Let's open in prayer. Well, Father God, what another glorious day we get to gather in your name, study your word. Lord, let your Holy Spirit transform our minds, our hearts, and our lives. Help us to hear your voice, Lord, again this evening. Help us to honor you and serve you in everything that we do and think. Help us to receive from you that which you have for us, Lord God, through the power of your word and the power of your Spirit. And we just want to commit this time into your hands through our Lord, our Savior, and the great King of Kings, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right. So we are in our second study, our second session of our look at the book of Esther. So come on in and turn your Bibles or devices or look on the screen. We are, so last week, not a lot of review necessary, I don't think. So we saw chapter 1. King Hazarus is a party guy, likes to drink and party and all of that. We saw him with his 180-day feast, however much you want to credit him for that. And then called in his former queen, or at that time the queen, Vashti, brought her in, or called her in, and she refused to come. So this declaration was made throughout all the empire, all the known world at the time, that Vashti would no longer be king, and then, of course, wives are supposed to honor and submit their husbands. And then we saw the transition, or the call, I guess I would say, for virgins, young, beautiful virgins, to be able to be brought in to the king. And so that whole preparation process we saw, it took them 12 months to go through. Once they were brought to the kingdom, to the capital city of Shushan and the citadel, they were brought in. They were given 6 months of preparation and then another 6 months of preparation. And through that, we got introduced to our two protagonists, if you will, of the story, both Mordecai and Esther, and they are first cousins by birth order and events, but Mordecai was really her acting father, or stand-in father, for most of her life, if not virtually all of her life. And so then we saw that she was, by obviously not just happenstance, but she was selected by King Hazarus to be the queen. So Esther becomes queen, and we saw that right there at the end, or the close of chapter 2, verse 18, where we finished off last week. And of course, King Hazarus declares a holiday in Esther's name and throws another party, and all of those things, just simply celebrating his new choice for a queen to replace Vashti. And that's where we left off last week. And so again, I think that's a pretty relatively quick summary. There's nothing too complicated about most of the events of the story. It's going to start building in terms of its intrigue, in terms of its levels of complexity and twists and turns of the plot, some irony and various things that are happening there. We'll see all that start to develop relatively quickly here. And I wanted to save this section of chapter 2 for tonight. I feel like it fits more in line with what happens next, what's going on in the story, and what you'll really see. If you read through the story here many times, you kind of know where we're headed. But if you kind of just envision it in terms of how we are approaching it, we are taking it, section by section, event by event. There is supposed to be this tension that's building for us, and we're not supposed to really know what's going to happen until the end. So you kind of got to put whatever you do know out of your mind to hopefully enjoy the story as it develops and as it builds. Because we looked at last time, it's considered one of these incredible literary stories in terms of having all of the various elements that would keep a reader interested in what's going to happen next, and how's this going to work out, and what's the significance of that event that just happened or was just stated. And we're going to find is all of the events in the book are really intentionally included and have a purpose or a foreshadowing of something that will happen as the story unfolds and develops. And that starts us off right here. The very last section here of chapter 2, 19 through 23, is we're going to find out that Mordecai, Esther's cousin, sometimes referred to as uncle, saves the King's Ahasuerus' life in 19 through 23. So let's read that account, and then we'll see what we can learn from it. So verse 19, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. In those days, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresae, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Okay, again, virtually every detail there, foreshadowing something you're going to need to know later. But let's talk about this as we go. So, first off, the very opening verse, right after was recorded that Hazarus had thrown a feast or a holiday in Esther's name, and the 7-day party that he established in that sense. He seemed to be completely head over heels taken with Esther in every capacity at the end there. And then very quickly you see a very large gap of time between verses 18 and 19 here in chapter 2. And it says right off the bat, there was a second gathering of young virgins even after Esther had been selected to be queen. So, there goes Ahasuerus. He's got this whole, however many hundreds or more came in that first gathering of new virgins when Esther came in. He picks Esther, he selects a queen, and he's not looking for a new queen, but there's still a continuing of a gathering process, a second time, of new virgins to add to the harem. So I would say this speaks negatively of King Ahasuerus, though certainly excesses such as excuses I should say, as all kings do the same thing, and they probably did, or a man has special needs that one woman cannot fulfill, would be used to mask his blatant infidelity for Esther here. Okay, I mean, this is, he's clearly going along with what the nations and the pagans would have a king do, and that is to gather as many beautiful young virgins or women into the harem as he possibly desires or could have. And so there's plenty of excuses. I'm just dreaming up some he might have come up with. These aren't in the text, but he certainly, I think you can make a case, even in Israel, all kings do it in the sense of having more than one woman in their relationship. All right, letter B here, having two harem houses of concubines and virgins, right? One is concubines for those that have been with the king, and virgins for those who are waiting to go for their chance to be with the king. For the king is a plot foreshadowing of events yet to come in the book, where Esther will have to risk her life to gain access to the king. And that's coming. We're going to see that start to develop here in the next chapter, that she knows that she's not the only one who has the king's eye or the king's attention, and it's because he's got this whole new crop of virgins about the same time as these events are going to start taking place, that she is not certain of her standing or her continued affection from Ahasuerus. Is it going to be upon her or not? This is part of developing that tension in the plot. And of course this is true. I'm not trying to say this is just a fictional story. This is an actual account of historical events, but it is written in such a way that we understand there's tension building within the events of the book. Okay, number 2. Esther was faithful and obedient to Mordecai's instructions about not revealing her ethnicity or her heritage to anyone in the palace. So she was obviously selected there right at the end of the last section from last week. And this also is a plot foreshadowing of events yet to be revealed. So she hadn't yet revealed her nationality, her ethnicity, her people group to King Ahasuerus. And Mordecai had charged her with that, and she is obeying her uncle, even though she's the queen of an empire. She's obeying him. She feels that his wisdom and his authority in her life was substantial enough that she should obey this command to just keep being Esther, never say I was born Hadassah, never say who and what family or nationality or people group that she was born to, at least not yet. Okay, and if she had already revealed this information, it would muddy up the whole rest of the story that we're looking at. So good on Mordecai and Esther for following this decision at that point. call them deceptive, call it lying, or just call it the right choice at the right time to keep that information that didn't need to be revealed from those who didn't need to hear it. So, number 3, Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. Obviously here in Shushan the Citadel, you'll see that name, just that city name, just constantly referenced throughout the text. So he's sitting in the king's gate. Again, he and Esther seem to be residents of that capital city. They weren't brought in from some other province or region or anything else in the empire. They were stationed before she ever got selected in Shushan, and of course that allows Mordecai to keep close tabs on his cousin and the daughter that he raised as one he raised as someone he loves himself. So what we don't know here is what was Mordecai's occupation or his position that he was permitted to sit in the gate. This is where, as we looked at with Ruth, the city gates, certainly of a capital city like Shushan, would be where official business always takes place. And so those sitting in the gates would often be, a ruler, an authority, a judge, somebody who, watches who comes in and out of the city or does business in the name of the official governing body of the city or something. We don't know what his position was. But it should be significant that he was there. That was where he spent his days. And so presumably he had an occupation that allowed him to do that, or an occupation that required him to be in those city gates area, meaning the seat of authority for the city. So, all right. Letter C, while Mordecai was at the gate at this time, whatever that was, at the gathering of the second group of virgins, he was made aware of a specific plot to kill the king. Okay. So 2 men were responsible for the plot, just 2 were named here, and they were eunuchs, which means they had royal authority. They were given positions within the king's inner, trusted group of advisors. They are there, and they have authority, they have power, they have status, but somehow there in the midst of the city gates, they start talking about a plot to assassinate Hazarus. Because they would become furious with the king, and it's not told to us why. I imagine there's thousands or upon thousands of various reasons why somebody might be angry with the king. He didn't listen to them. He made some command that harmed them or injured them in some way, or they just completely disagreed with, whatever it was. We don't know. But it would be certainly an act of treason or an act of sedition to bring him, to a place where we're going to replace him as king of the empire. So in their anger, they express this desire and also devise a plan to lay their hands on King Ahasuerus to kill him. So their intention was, and that's kind of what you have to do with the king. You can't just say, hey, we're going to vote you out of office or have a recall or anything else. If you don't want him a king anymore, you're going to kill him. That's the only way to get him out of office. So that was their plan. That was the plot. So Mordecai, upon hearing of this murder plot, told Esther what was planned by these men against her husband, the king. And so Esther was informed directly, or then goes in and directly informs the king, and she tells the king, hey, look, she says Mordecai, who sits in the city gate, we don't know if she made mention that he was an uncle or a cousin or not, but she says, Mordecai, by name, Mordecai, who's in the city, who's at the city gates, overheard of these 2 eunuchs plotting a assassination against the king, and she told it to the king. And so she gave all the information that was provided to her by Mordecai. She gives it to her husband, King Ahasuerus. So the king and Mordecai, and this is important again, more of this, did not directly meet over the circumstances or the information gathered in this event. But the king did launch an inquiry into the matter and was able to officially confirm by this information provided by Mordecai and Esther that the plot was actually affirmed. It was planned, and his life was in danger. So letter G there, both eunuchs who devised the plot were hanged, and I have that in quotes, on gallows, and I have that in quotes. And this most likely means, according to historical understanding of methods of execution that had been developed at this time, that they were more than likely impaled on execution stake, not how you and I would contemplate in our 21st century brains, gallows and being hanged, even thinking about, horse thieves and ancient, or in the Old West or whatever. We're not talking about that. It's probably an impaling stake seems to be the method of execution. So they're using terms in English here that connote something different than probably what the text implies. And we'll see some of that pop its head back up here in later chapters. So anyway, that was the method of execution at the time in Persia, was this impaling. They later switched to crucifixion, but that wouldn't be considered a hanging or gallows. It would be a cross and a crucifixion sometime later in their kingdom development. Okay, letter H. All of these events, again, foreshadow future events to be revealed later in the book. So we got to just kind of keep those tucked in our mind. All that Mordecai reported and all that this assassination plot was revealed and all the things that are going on here. So what's going to happen, we'll find, is that all these details will be revealed to us in the story, but to the actual participants in the events here. It'll be revealed according to God's providential working in the lives of his people. And I'll remind you here that God, in any shape, matter, or name or form, is not mentioned in the book of Esther directly. So there's a number of places where he should have been, number of places where you can imply he must have been, but his name is never specifically mentioned, or name, title, anything about God is not specifically mentioned. So anyway, that's that short section there at the end of chapter 3, and it's important. You just tuck that away. Mordecai understood about this assassination plot. It was told to the king that Mordecai was the one who had made the report, and the king's life has clearly been saved here at this point. Okay. So the next event, starting in chapter 3, we're going to see is that Haman, we haven't been introduced to Haman yet. We'll talk about him as we go. Haman's rise to power and his prideful conspiracy against all of Mordecai's people is the next section of verses here, 3 through 1 through 15, whole chapter basically. And so let's read through this and see what is going on next in the story. So after these things, King Hazarus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened, when they spoke to him daily, he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the first month, which is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people, scattered and dispersed among all the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you. Do with them as seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all the people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Hazarus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. And a copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. All right. So let's kind of walk through this. This is a major threat to the nation of Israel here in this time period, 400 or 500 years before Christ was born, or 400 years or so before Christ was born. And so we're going to look at this both from the perspective, yes, it's a serious threat to God's people and obviously God's plan through his people, but there's also just a number of events or details here given that will help us to really understand the situation if we look at them. So, number one, after these things, Esther becoming queen and Mordecai saving the king's life, both of those events back in chapter 2. And based on the verse 7 of chapter 3 here, this was approximately 5 years after Esther becomes queen. Okay, so she's been queen for about 5 years, and this is when this next thing happens, is Haman. We don't know about exactly when Mordecai learned of the assassination plot and reported it to Esther, who reported it to the king. But we know that Haman was promoted about 5 years after Esther becomes queen, and Mordecai refuses to bow, and this is what enrages Haman and causes this proclamation to be made. Okay, so just within there, we don't have any other time points or time references, so this event happens about 5 years after she becomes queen. Everything else must have happened somewhere in between there. Okay, we don't know exactly when that was. Number 2, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman above all the princes of his empire. He effectively becomes prime minister. We see that throughout biblical accounts. Somebody rises, like Joseph essentially rises to prime minister of Egypt in his day, or Daniel rises about essentially level of prime minister under the Babylonian Empire, and then again in the Persian Empire before he dies and before all these events took place. Okay. So he's promoted to that kind of that second in charge. He's really, the king gets to do kingly things that are fun and puts the prime minister in charge to do all the business affairs and the military affairs or tax collection affairs, whatever it is of the kingdom. So letter A, under number 2, he's the son of Hamadatha the Agagite. Likely, so we're going to walk through this a little bit. I want you to see this because I think this is also important to kind of understand the situation here. He's likely a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, who Saul failed to judge when God commanded him to do so in 1 Samuel 15. So he's Haman the Agagite. He's likely a descendant of that tribe. I think that's why that extra information, that extra detail is given to us here in Esther, because they want us to know about, well, where did he come from? And maybe why is he so enraged with wrath against the Jewish people? Let's look back at 1 Samuel 15. I'm going to read through that whole chapter because there's just no way to parse it out. I'm going to read through that chapter. I want you to get a sense of who Haman's ancestor was, or ancestry roots were through that. So if you want to turn in your own scriptures to 1 Samuel 15 or look on the screen, let's read through starting in verse 1. Okay, so this, I'll set the plot if you're still trying to turn there. So the period of the judges end, that's when we saw the book of Ruth, right? And then we see that at the end of the period of the judges, they demand a king. They demand, Israel says, we need a king. We must have a king. This whole God being our king thing isn't working for us. Give us a human king. And so the Lord says, all right, I'll give him Samuel. And I'll give him Saul. I'll tell Samuel to give them Saul, and Saul becomes king, and he has all of the exterior characteristics of a good king. He's tall, he's strong, he's good looking. All those things I guess the people wanted. Sorry, I'm trying to sneeze. So that's such a situation. So the very, very first king of the nation of Israel, after they come out of Moses and Joshua, a period of the judges, they demand a king, and they get Saul anointed by Samuel to be the first king of Israel. So in verse 1 of chapter 15, 1 Samuel, Samuel also said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel and how he ambushed him on the way when he," that is Israel, the nation, "came up out of Egypt. Now, go attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them. Kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt." So the Kenites departed from the Amalekites. And Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatlings and the lambs and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, "I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments." And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, "Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he has set up a monument for himself." And he has gone on and passed by and gone down to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?" And Saul said, "Well, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed." Then Samuel said to Saul, "Be quiet. I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night." And he said to him, "Speak on." So Samuel said, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" And Saul said to Samuel, But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and gone on a mission to which the Lord sent me, and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. And I've utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder, the sheep, the oxen, the best things, which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." So Samuel said, Has the Lord as a great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now, therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to Saul, "I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." And Samuel turned around to go his way, and Saul seized the edge of his robe and tore it. So Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor, to a neighbor of yours, who is better than you. And also the strength of Israel will not lie nor relent, for he is not a man that he should relent." Then he said, "I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me." So Agag came to him cautiously, and Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of this death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so your mother may be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag into pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to the house of Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Now, that last part was just, closing out that chapter. But I want you to walk through what's going on here, because I think if we're, understanding this correctly, Saul did not spare only Agag, the only human being of the Amalekites. There's more Amalekites. They're mentioned later, and we see even here in Esther that Haman is a descendant of the Agites, which means they were still around. They were still a part of all of this. Okay, so even though Samuel had clearly a fun youth group story here, hacked Agag into pieces, the mission God sent Saul on to utterly destroy the Amalekites was not complete, and there were descendants of Amalekite remaining and Agag remaining. Okay. So Haman, the Agite, could not possibly have existed 600 years later if Saul had actually obeyed God's command. Okay. So we're starting to see the implications or ramifications of failure to obey the Lord playing itself out in the Persian Empire with Mordecai and Esther and Haman and King Hazarus 600 years after Saul failed to obey the Lord. And as we see over and over again in Scripture, actions have consequences, and failed actions also have consequences. So we saw last week that David, by his grace, spared Shimei, that man who was cursing and throwing stones at David, and he said, "Look, let him live. We deserve the cursings he's offering to us." Right? So David spared Shimei, and Shimei was a grandfather of Mordecai and Esther, the protagonist of the story. David was obeying the Lord, and we get a couple of champions and a couple of heroes in the Old Testament presented to us because of David's obedience to the Lord and his showing of grace to those who most kings would never have even considered showing grace to. By contrast, Saul, in his fear, pride, and greed, spared Agag and the Amalekites, and that sparing of them has had nearly disastrous consequences here in the story of Esther, meaning Haman almost succeeded. Very, very close to succeeding in completely wiping out the Jews, although God, of course, had a different plan. But we see this contrast. David, a humble servant of the Lord, yes, he made a lot of mistakes, but he lived in submission to the Lord. He would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed Saul, even though it seemed like God or somebody was giving him all these opportunities to take Saul out of the equation. He said, "No, I won't do that." And we saw it with Shimei. "No, I won't just kill this man because he's uttering curses at me." But here Saul had a specific command from the Lord to kill every breathing Amalekite on the planet because of their sins against God, and God wanted them to be done with. And 600 years later, there's still a battle going on between the Israelites or the Jews and the Amalekites. Okay. The consequences of actions or inactions we're supposed to take note of that, I believe, here. So note that when the Jews read Esther in their public services, the mention of the name of Haman is often met with loud boos, groans, and stomping of feet. Doesn't work very well here on this floor, but if every time if I were reading the book of Esther, if I were in an audience here of Jews, they would immediately go, boo! Right? Haman. I don't know, is anybody else in the whole Old Testament, account where the Jews specifically respond so emotionally to a person's name? But as I understand it, that still happens. That they will not want Haman's name spoken without recognizing the source that he is evil to the core, and presented as such in the story. You don't have to do that. I'm just saying that's how that's historically have treated the name of Haman anytime Esther is read in their synagogues. Number 3. All other servants of King Hazarus were in the city gates and bowed and paid homage. So we're back to the story of Esther here. Bowed and paid homage to Haman in reverence for his high position in the empire. They all saw it. The king commanded that they would do it. They all did it. It was Mordecai alone who held a desire not to bow down and worship and not to pay honor or homage to Haman. So Mordecai, however, refused to bow and paid this homage. So the servants of the king noticed Mordecai. They're all bowing down, and they look over, and here's Mordecai. I don't know what exact posture he had, but he's saying, "Nope, I'm not doing that. He can take off my head, but I'm not going to bow down to him." I think you get that basic image of it's not worth it. I will not bow down to this man. And maybe Mordecai knew that he was an Agagite. Okay, maybe he knew the heritage and the story behind it, and that he shouldn't even exist on the planet, because if Saul had done his job, he wouldn't be here. Who knows, right? Exactly what Mordecai knew, it doesn't tell us. But Mordecai refused, and then he tells them, so we can kind of imply here that they asked him, why aren't you bowing down? Don't you know you're putting your life at risk? And he says, I'm a Jew. And I think saying I'm a Jew is supposed to answer all questions. Why I don't bow down to anybody else who declares themselves to be divine or worthy of such honor. I'm a Jew, and I don't do that. That would go against my beliefs. That would go against the law. But of course, God and the law and all of those kind of things are not mentioned in the book of Esther. Okay. But notice he previously told Esther not to reveal her, I don't know why I put he there, her Jewish heritage. But Mordecai himself did not follow that same advice. He told people when asked, I'm a Jew. That's why I'm doing or not doing what's going on here. But Esther, he had said, do not reveal your heritage, or at least not at this time. Okay. So I'll note here several times that this seems an occasion like it would have been a good opportunity to witness about Yahweh to those who are asking him a question. Why don't you bow down to Haman? Because there's one God, and God is the only one who is worthy of being laying prostrate or honoring someone in this very reverent way. He could have witnessed to them. He could have told them all about it, and maybe he did, but it's not recorded in the book here. Okay, or he could have talked about his legal obligations, about how God has commanded various things throughout the commandment that are given to Moses, and been a great witnessing opportunity. But again, no mention of is made of God, the law of Moses, or anything else is included in the text. And you're going to start seeing it as we go. There's going to be all these head-scratching moments. Why didn't the writer put God somewhere in here? I mean, it's so obvious by its absence, by its non-inclusion, that it's intentionally being left out. Okay, and we'll talk about that as we wrap up the book a few weeks from now. Okay. Letter C. The other servants spoke to Mordecai daily, not just once, but daily, however long this is going on, daily about his refusal to bow, and seemingly encouraged him to comply and warned him against the consequences. But he would not listen. He refused to do any of these things for Haman. So after some time, they probably said, look, if you don't start bowing down to him, like, by the end of next week or end of the month or whatever it was, we're gonna actually tell Haman directly about your insolence, your insubordination, whatever. Okay, so they said they're gonna watch him, and we're gonna tell him, look, we're gonna go tell Mordecai, and he still didn't bow down. So then they go and tell they go and tell Haman to see if he'll bow down, and they still keep watching him. It's like every time they do something, it's like what's Mordecai doing? Is he actually going to get this or not? What's going to come about of Mordecai's refusal to obey the prime minister of this empire? So they watched and see if he'd comply or not, and then they eventually report directly his refusal to Haman. So when Haman personally witnessed Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him, he was filled with wrath. Okay, I mean, here's this guy. We're going to see throughout the story as a man filled with pride, filled with arrogance, filled with narcissism to the extreme. He wants everything. And so he has complete wrath when he sees Mordecai refusing to bow down to him. Okay. And I would say that I think Haman likely had more than enough authority to arrest or even execute Mordecai on the spot. Here's a guy, the king has ordered that everyone should bow down and pay homage to Haman anytime he's around, anytime he enters or leaves the city, whatever. I'm sure he had the full authority to take Mordecai out. Okay. But look, in his pride, Haman was looking for punishment, not just for Mordecai, but he wanted, I put Haman in here, Mordecai, and all of his people. So Haman's like, look, it's not good enough that I just take off this one man's head for failing to bow down. I want his people throughout the empire destroyed for this one man's failure to obey me. That's enragement and pride, and that is incredible level of hubris, I would say, to say, I want every person who has his blood flowing through their veins in some capacity or another, or Jewish blood flowing through their veins, I want them destroyed. So he had an opportunity, I think, to destroy or kill Mordecai, but he was rolling the dice. He was taking a full advantage and saying, I want this guy out, and I'm willing to let him live ultimately for an entire year, and then I'm going to get my way because he's going to die. But everybody he knows, everybody he loves, everybody that's part of his family or his heritage will also die if I get my way. Okay, you see the difference there between one man wasn't going to be quite satisfactory enough for his anger and his wrath and his pride, but the whole people group, he thought, now that, I'll be really satisfied if that happens. Tim?
Don't you surmise also that he knew his history and that Saul had taken out his...
Yeah, yep. I think...
This is his opportunity to get...
Yes, exactly. I think it's very possible, in fact, I think that the notes will express that both Haman and Mordecai know about their personal histories that lead back to Saul and King Agag and Samuel hacking him to death. I think both of them do agree. So, do you think Haman thought that his people group, the Amalekites, were sinners and should have been destroyed? Or do you think he thought, who in the world is this Samuel hacking our king to death? And why did Saul attack and destroy most of our people and most of our cities and all of that? There's tension there for sure. And I think I think we can generally assume that both men probably, as soon as they heard Amalekite and Jew, probably immediately triggered back to what events that we looked at back in 1 Samuel 15. Okay. All right, so the fact that Mordecai was Jewish may have brought up this generational and ethnic hatred for all Jews, and it perhaps goes back to Saul and Samuel. It could have even gone back all the way to Moses. When Moses is leading, and we saw that reference there by God in 1 Samuel, God was leading Israel out of Egypt into the promised land, and they asked Amalekites, can we just pass through your territory? We'll leave you alone, you leave us alone. And nope, there was hatred and tension all the way through that process. So it could have gone all the way back to Moses, but certainly could have gone back to Saul and Samuel and King Agag. All right. And so Haman's plan was to use Mordecai's act of disobedience or dishonoring him as a political tool to fully exterminate the Jews from the empire everywhere. This would satisfy his anger. This would satisfy his wrath, so he thinks. Okay. All right, so with this anger and with his temporary letting Mordecai do what Mordecai was doing by dishonoring him, he thinks he's going to get the upper hand. He's going to get the better end of the deal. He's got the king's ear. He's got the king's attention. So Haman then goes in, as we saw in the text here, convinces King Ahasuerus, who's obviously portrayed as kind of weak, just whatever anybody throws at him, he's okay with it. He's kind of, again, we saw that in chapter 1. So Vashti has, refused to come. What should I do? Oh, well, first off, make her, get her out of the kingdom, remove her queen role, and then make sure you send an order out to all the empire that all wives and all women obey the person, and all those kind of stuff. So we're not supposed to see King Ahasuerus as some kind of really strong, powerful, independent thinking leader. He's got Haman brought in, and he's listening to Haman and doesn't even ask enough questions to find out really what's going on here. Okay. So, letter A, to make it seem more like the fate of the Jews was in the hands of their pagan deities, first thing that Haman does is cast lots. Oh, well, if we cast lots, well, then, clearly our gods want us to do this. So we're going to cast lots to see when our gods want the Jewish people destroyed. It's not just, in my own, pride. It's like, I want to destroy the Jews, so let's cast the lots, let's roll the dice, let's find out what they have to say. Oh, look where it landed. Let's kill them in the 12th month. That's when it'll happen. Okay, so they're appeasing their pagan deities. I'm not saying none of these are atheist type people. They're appeasing their deities and appealing to them and trying to get kind of that stamp of approval. Oh, well, when he goes in and talks to the king, we cast lots, and the lots told us that this is when the Israelites are to die. This is when the Jewish people should be annihilated. Letter B, so the act of casting lots actually occurred in the first month on the Jewish calendar. I'm sure the Persians and others would have used a different calendaring system, but we're told about the story from a Jewish perspective. So that's in the month of Nisan, which for us is in March, April. But the point of the story is they cast lots in the first month, and the lots fell to kill them in the 12th month. So basically, God is giving them, or the casting of lots is giving them 11 or 12 months to deal with the situation. Both sides, really. Okay. So the lot, which is called a pur, that's what the word there used, and we'll talk about the Feast of Purim later on in the study here. But they cast lots, and the lot was cast for the king's order to be carried out in the 12th month, as I said, giving both sides about 11 months to strategize their plans in response to what this king's decree would be. We haven't seen the king's decree yet as far as unpacking this, but it's 11 months. That's the time period that we're given, and it obviously gives both sides an ample opportunity to kind of, well, what do we do about this? So then Haman comes into the king and describes the problem to try and convince him of the reason why this proposed order should be issued. So it gives a number of kind of logical, easy to follow kind of reasons that he wants the king to be able to follow through. So look, first off, you're not going to lose territory. They're scattered. These Jews are scattered all around your empire. So if we take out 5%, 10% of the empire in every city, it won't hurt you too bad. It's not like we're taking out the whole southern region or the whole northern action here. They're all scattered. This is supposed to be considered favorable to the king's understanding. I'm not going to lose one of my borders. I'm not going to have to reinforce some area because they're all scattered. Does that make sense? They're scattered. So the king's not going to suffer some kind of loss in these various regions or cities because all of the Jews are killed on one day. Point number 2, the Jews live under different laws and do not obey the king's laws. Well, the first statement is probably true, although as we've seen throughout the Old Testament, the Jews hardly ever even follow their own laws. But nevertheless, yes, they have different laws, not unreasonable or understandable. And do not obey the king's laws. Well, as far as we know, the only law that was broken was Mordecai refusing to bow down to Haman. And so, but he's saying all of the people, all of the Jews are simply lawbreakers. They refuse to follow any order the king issues. You don't want these disobedient lawbreakers throughout the kingdom. Let's just get rid of them as an entire people group. So they're identified as lawless troublemakers, somebody the king would be right to exterminate. Point number 4. Haman proposes that the king issue a decree, but Haman will go ahead and write it for him. So look, it's not going to take any of your time. We're just going to take this Jewish group of people and we're going to exterminate them. You don't even have to raise a finger or try and figure out how to word the king's order. I'll do that part for you. I'll just write the order for you, right? So it's easy. Just say yes and I'll make it happen, right? You don't have to think very hard. It's just going to take any extra time out of your day to order the annihilation of this group of people. Number 5, Haman seals the proposal by offering to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the king's treasury, which is about 665,000 or 66,000 pounds of silver, or roughly $150 million, give or take, given whatever time period. So Haman's a rich man, I think. Okay, he's prime minister. He's a rich man. He offers $150 million, let's say, to get this group of people off the planet. Okay, so he's very committed to seeing their extermination and willing to pull money out of his own treasury, his own pocket, in order to make that happen. King Hazarus promptly accepted Haman's proposal here, and then he gives him his signet ring to formally seal the decree. Here's my ring. Anything you write and put in stamp or emblazon with my ring will have my authority to go along with it. So the king gives him all of that. And then we see the king tell Haman, look, the money in the treasury are yours. Okay, go ahead and do what you want to do with them. Whatever seems best to you, make it work. And some commentators view this as kind of a typical Middle Eastern negotiating tactic, right? Where you go, well, I don't need your money. We saw that with Abraham and trying to buy the field for his wife. I'll give you this. No, we don't. What is that? We don't need that. And he says, no, I insist. And this is kind of that typical negotiating tactic. You have to refuse first before you can accept. Okay, so the king is seeming to say, no, Haman, I don't need $150 million in the treasury. But then, clearly he wants $150 million of silver in the treasury, so they're just in this negotiating thing, and the Haman will go ahead and do that. But of course, he's also saying, we're going to exterminate the Jews, and we're going to take their plunder. We're going to plunder them. And so Haman might think of it, well, yeah, I'm going to spend $150 million, but I might get twice or 4 times that back in terms of gathering from their possessions once they're dead. Part of the whole thought process here materialistically. All right, number 7. The king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, so midway through the first month, to officially write, copy, and send Haman's orders throughout the entire empire. So all of the officials of the king participated in this extermination order. So they all agreed. Haman calls them in. They all report to him. They all begin to conspire or to write these official orders to exterminate the Jews. And then the orders were written in every language and for every province to receive. So wherever they were, whatever language they spoke in that part of the empire, the information would come to them in their own language, and they'd receive a specific copy of this order to kill the Jews. So letter C, Haman and the scribes wrote this in the name of the king, but the king is clearly not involved directly with this edict. Okay, he just knows Haman wants to give me 666,000 pounds of silver, and he is claiming these lawbreakers should be exterminated, and I agree. He's not participating in the actual order. But then the orders were sealed by the king's signet ring, and it makes it completely legal and official. And as we talked about before, I probably have it in my notes again somewhere else, but remember, the laws of the Persians cannot be changed. Okay? And we'll see that come up again and again in the story here, that the laws of the kings and the Persians cannot be changed. So the king himself cannot violate a prior king's order or even his own order. And we saw that with Cyrus and Daniel in the lions, or Darius and Daniel in the lion's den. His closest advisors say, hey, let's throw anybody who doesn't worship you into the lion's den. And he says, okay, let's do that. Signs the order. And then Daniel refuses and says, hey, Daniel hasn't bowed down and worshiped you. He says, oh, not Daniel. I never wanted Daniel to go in the lion's den. But he can't do anything about it because he signed the order. It's law. He can't change his own law. So he just camps out and waits for Daniel to see how it's going to be for Daniel in the morning after Daniel spends the night in the lion's den. Same kind of thing. The laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed or altered. And so once they've made it official, this had to happen. The order had to happen, whatever it was. And so that plays out, as I said, in multiple chapters down the road. So then the couriers would were used to take the orders out to every region, every province throughout the empire. And the order specifically called for these actions against the Jews, all Jews. Haman's rage in all of this is evident. To kill, to destroy, and to annihilate. Can't just use one. I think any one of them would have done, but he's kind of enraged. I want to kill the Jews. I want to destroy the Jews. I want to annihilate the Jews. Make sure it's clear. Okay? And then he says, both young and old, little children and women, all on one day. This is going to happen all in one day. We want the whole empire focused on one task on this day, whenever the gods have told us to do it by lot. And so in one day, we're going to go from 1 million Jews in the empire to 0 Jews in the empire in one day. That's the plan. Okay. And then plunder all of their possessions to restock the treasury. Letter G. The non-Jewish people then had 11 months to prepare themselves, get weapons ready and strategies, and kind of identify who's a Jew in our community, who are we going to kill and plunder their goods by order of the king. Right? They're kind of strategizing. Do we have enough weapons? How many do they have? Let's make sure we have enough. All of these kind of plans in place to ensure that it could actually be successful when that specific day had come. All right, number 8. Once the king's order went out, King Hazarus and Haman sat down to a nice, relaxing drink, completely unconcerned about what they had just done. Now, I want to just compare this between God, the creator of the universe, saying that a sinful group of people must be destroyed by his command. The moral or the implications of that. Saul didn't have to worry. King Saul didn't have to worry. Is this the right thing to do? God himself said, this is what you must do. Here, you have Haman and Hazarus going, yeah, sure, it's fine. Let's go ahead and wipe out an entire people group. I have no moral objections to it whatsoever. I can go to sleep at night and I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to worry about what the gods think or what, my creator thinks. Completely different mindset. Okay, Saul is simply called to obey, and God has his reasons and his purpose to order the destruction of the Amalekites. Hazarus and Haman have absolutely no justification for trying to destroy this people group because one man refused to bow down to him. But they're going to have a drink and probably have no problem getting to sleep on this night. Number 9. However, the city of Shushan was perplexed and confused by the king's decree. Can you imagine? It doesn't say, but they're perplexed. The whole city is perplexed. Can you imagine? Why the Jews? They were not making any specific trouble. I mean, they know about Mordecai, but, they're perplexed. What's going on? Why did this decree from the king come out against this one people group in the empire? And you can imagine they might be asking themselves, well, who's next? If they're willing to wipe out the Jews from the empire, what about my ethnicity? What about my people group? Are we going to be on the king's chopping list next? How can other ethnicities in the empire know that they won't be targeted by similar future decrees? I imagine that would raise a lot of tension and concern within the city, even if you're not Jewish. And, could anything have been done to avoid the same fate? So what do we do? How do we avoid the same fate as a people group? If the Jews have so enraged the king or so enraged the prime minister, what do we need to do? They're perplexed. They don't know how to respond to this order. All right, so that's the order, that's the decree, that's the building tension within this story of Esther. What's going to happen? An unchangeable order and decree of the king of the empire is that in this day on the 12th month, all Jews must be exterminated. Building tension. Okay, so we'll pick up in the next part of the story, the next chapter here after our break. So we'll pick up in chapter 4 and cover that in about 5 minutes. And we'll get back together. So all of these chapters are relatively short. So this whole study goes relatively quick, but we're in chapter 4, so the first 15 verses of chapter 3 we read through. Now we're in chapter 4. We'll see specifically how Mordecai and Esther will begin to strategize on how to save their people from this decree. So, in chapter 4, verse 1, when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry, and went as far as the front of the king's gate. For no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree had arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and to take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hazarus, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend to her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hazarus went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and he might command her to go into the king and make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hazarus returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hazarus and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Okay, so we're seeing this back and forth. They clearly cannot talk to each other. We'll talk about that. So Mordecai's initial response when he sees or hears what has been decreed of his people or by Haman and by the king, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. Now, of course, as we're probably pretty familiar, this is a common practice for Jewish mourning, but still no attempt here to call out to God for help. It's like, why, Mordecai? Why wouldn't you say, we're gonna do these things and cry out to God? It's implied in the mourning, it's implied in the fasting, it's implied in the sackcloth, but it's never stated in the text. Okay. Mordecai cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He wanted to be heard by God, perhaps, or perhaps the king. He maybe goes as far as he's permitted to go legally, and he's crying out as loud as he can, like he wants the king or the kingdom to hear him cry over this decree that has been issued. I mean, if he perishes, he perishes. He doesn't care. They kill him for making noise. He doesn't care. His whole people have been given an order that they're going to be extinguished and exterminated in 11 months. What's the difference? He doesn't care. So we're not sure. We're not told exactly why the loud cries, why this performance. And I'm not saying it was, manipulative. It was just why he was doing the strong cries out in the city gates, right before the king's gates. Why he was doing this doesn't say. He just says he was fasting and mourning in sackcloth and ashes. And so he could only go as far as the king's gate. His act of mourning in sackcloth prevented any further access. So one of the laws of the Medes and the Persians was no one can come into the king in this mourning attitude of sackcloth and ashes. So he went as far as he could. The Jews throughout the empire likewise mourned, fasted, they wailed and they wept, and when they received this news. Many also laid down in sackcloth and ashes. Now, we recognize Jews are experts at this mourning process. And that's not a pejorative statement. They have really perfected how you demonstrate deep, sorrowful mourning in a external way. Right? We don't do it as much. We probably internalize things in America or whatever, but we internalize things a lot. They have this practice. In fact, they even had professional mourners. If you needed people to mourn for you, you could hire them and come and mourn for some loss of a loved one or some event that was going on. You could hire them and they would come and professionally mourn. But the Jews, we just see that as a people group. They generally mourn in a very obvious, overt way, far more than many other people groups, certainly of our day. All right, and again here, still no mention of God or prayer. Seems like a perfect time. Pray to God. We've been ordered to be exterminated. If you haven't prayed before, it might be a good time to pray now. But no mention of Yahweh, no mention of God, no mention of prayer, and nothing of that. It's like it's been edited out of the text or intentionally left out. Number 6. So Esther, as queen, was stationed at the palace and may not have been at liberty to go out into the city proper and to socialize with male servants or male people, males of any kind, such as Mordecai. So she cannot have this conversation directly. He's raised her, he's like a father to her, but he's out there and she's in the kingdom in the palace, and they're going to have to work through this intermediary communication process, which goes back and forth and probably a little frustrating to both of them, but they could not bridge that gap. She could not go and have a conversation with him. All right, so Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about the extreme mourning of Mordecai in the city. So presumably Esther's servants would not maybe have known the exact relationship between her and Mordecai, but they surely knew there was this personal connection between the two of them. We don't know exactly what they knew or how much they knew. She still clearly had not revealed herself to be a Jew. We don't know if what she told them about the relationship, but when her servants, those who were close to her, cared for her, I'm sure had a strong, positive relationship with her. When they hear or see Mordecai extreme mourning going on just outside the king's gate, they come and tell Esther, the person you know as Mordecai is upset. He is deeply upset. What do you want to do about it? Okay. So Esther, I think, clearly had not heard what the king's order commanded, not come to her. They had written these orders and decrees in every language and every people group, and they'd sent it out to everywhere. But here she is in the women's house of the palace. Did they think, they needed to send one of these decrees into the women's house? Probably not. And so she's sitting there, probably has no idea of what Haman has done, why it was impacting her or Mordecai or all of her people. Okay, so just simply not aware from what we can gather from the text. So what she does, when she hears about his mourning, though, she sends him a fresh set of garments to wear in exchange for a sackcloth. Like, I don't know what's bothering you, but here, why don't you put on some good, clean clothes and, maybe, start to think better about life than what you're currently doing. But he would not accept them, so he's refusing her, request to stop mourning, to move away from this extreme mourning process. And it may be that she thought he was in mourning over something that he thought was happening with her. Like, hey, I haven't heard from Esther in a month. I haven't heard from Esther in 6 months, and I just don't even know she's okay, and he's mourning, and maybe she thinks he doesn't know I'm safe. He doesn't know I'm healthy. He doesn't know I'm doing just fine. So let me send him some clothes, and he'll know they came from me. He'll know I'm doing fine, and maybe that will resolve the issue. That's just one potential thought process that's going on here. Her gesture of sending garments, it might just simply let her know that she was doing fine. So Esther learned that Mordecai refused her offer of fresh garments. She then sends Hathach out. He's a eunuch of the king appointed to serve her. So he's one of these royal servants serving in the women's house, specifically appointed to her. So she can kind of command him or order him to go and do her bidding, which do the things she can't do. So he can go out into the city, she can't. So she specifically sends Hathach out and to find out directly from Mordecai, okay, so what's the issue? I sent you some clothes. That didn't fix anything. So I'm going to send my personal messenger out to you. I want to know what's going on. Why are you so upset, Mordecai? So then, of course, in the back and forth, Mordecai explains the decree and gives her a personal copy to take back, or gives Hathach a copy to take back to Esther so she can read and understand why he would be mourning. And I can imagine he's thinking, you'll know when you read it. It's pretty simple. Kill and destroy and annihilate, man, women, child, everything. Going to make sure the Jews are dead by the time this day is over. She'll figure it out. So he sends a copy back to her. And then Mordecai firmly, through this, back and forth, he instructs Esther to go directly into the king's presence and make supplication to him and plead for him to spare the Jews, which were also her people. It's like, go in and make supplication. You're the queen. You have an audience with the king. Go and talk to him and tell him this is not, we've got to stop this. Now, whether Mordecai knows about the laws of the Medes and Persians, they can't be changed. We don't even know what he's asking Esther to do. But he's asking her to go and tell the king, this is deeply upsetting. You've ordered the destruction of my people. Okay? And so we don't know what he's really asking. We don't know what solutions he might be able to offer. There's too much distance between Mordecai and Esther, but he is directly requesting that she go in and she talked to the king and get this thing resolved. I think that's the implication of what's being said here. So, but Esther, I think she reads the decree that's issued against her and her people. She understands it, but she wants to make sure Mordecai also understands this may not work out the way you have you're planned in your mind. You're asking me to go in and deal with this with the king, but here, I got to tell you what's going on as well. So, first off, the laws in the Medes and the Persians established that a queen, not even a queen, can go into the presence of the king without being invited. Okay? And so the penalty for violating this law was death unless the king extended favor to the person who came without being requested to come. This is the law of the Persians. The king, so look here, so no matter how much Hazarus, the king, loved Esther, if the law required her death, even by some kind of technicality, he was powerless to stop it. Okay? So, the king could, we know, she tells him, the king can extend this golden scepter to spare her life. But, Mordecai, many things can go wrong in this plan. There's so many things that can go wrong with this plan. So, you got to understand that. So, she and the king would both suffer if everything were not done exactly according to Persian law at the right and proper time. So she goes in, and we don't know. King, it could go really wrong. Are you sure you want me to do this now at this time? Is kind of her statement to all of this. Because, like I said, the king. This is not Hazarus's policy. He didn't just say, look, I'm tired of people coming in unannounced and uninvited, so just, if they come in and I haven't invited them, just kill them. No, there's a law. The law of the Persians says that any person, man or woman, who comes in uninvited must be killed. Well, unless the king extends a scepter to them. Okay, so many things that have to go right with this. So she also wants Mordecai to know and understand, look, she's not been in the presence of the king for the past 30 days. Now, no reason is given for this, and there's no reason to suspect directly that she was no longer favored by the king. She was with him a month ago. We don't necessarily know. We can speculate, right? All kinds of reasons. Who knows? There's, king's been busy. He's out of town. He's going through a phase where he wants all the other virgins or whatever else. We're not explaining here. But, she just wants him to know, look, it's been 30 days. It's not like I saw him yesterday. It's not like, well, he might call me tomorrow, because he calls me every other day or calls me every Thursday or whatever. It's like, I just don't know what to expect and whether or not this is going to be something. So I'm not sure whether this will work out, is what she's trying to tell Mordecai. However, if the king's heart was not in the proper mood when she came in without being called, she would surely perish. Can you imagine? He's just in a bad mood. He just had a bad meeting with one of his other, magistrates or somebody in there, and he's like, I don't want to deal with Esther right now. Send her away. Not even thinking about the law, right? He's just like, I'm in a bad mood. She's, I don't have time to deal with her. Maybe I'll go talk to her tonight. Who knows? Can you imagine if you're your wife going into your husband's office in the middle of the day, kind of unannounced, and he's in the middle of fighting fires, this, that, and the other thing, whatever his occupation is. And you're like, I don't have time to deal with you right now, honey. Go away. Well, in that sense, go away means go die, right? I mean, that's is he going to remember that she will die if he sends her away? That's the question, I think, in her mind. Okay, so if his heart's not in the right spot, at the moment she arrives, this will go south and she will not live. So number 10, Mordecai received Esther's message and responded back to her with a message back to her. So Esther should consider that she will not escape the king's decree. So if the king does not rescind the order, her Jewish heritage will be discovered and she will certainly die. No question, no doubt, she will die, and it will be, if this is happening to the Jewish people, God's not going to let one Jewish woman survive this process. If he's going to wipe out the whole nation, God's going to let this happen, she's going to die too. Okay. So Mordecai is actually confident that relief and deliverance will come for the Jews. Again, no mention of God. I'm confident, Esther, that the Jewish people will survive this order and decree by the king, but you won't, right? But it's like, again, why not mention God? I'm confident that God will save and deliver his people, but if you block the opportunity, he's going to work through somebody else, and you and your father's house or the name of your house will certainly perish. You don't want that, so he's confident that God's going to do something, and he never mentions God. Letter C. Perhaps Mordecai is asking Esther to consider which powerful man she thinks will have a better chance of surviving. She'll have a better chance of surviving with a Hazarus who loves her, or Haman who has clearly a seething hatred for all Jews. Which one do you think is a better choice for you, Esther? You're going to go into the husband who's demonstrated love for you. Years earlier, he proclaimed a holiday in your name. Or Haman the Agagite who hates all Jews. What's your option? What do you want to do? Okay, you're probably right, Mordecai. It's probably better to go and talk to my husband and see if I survive this event rather than waiting on Haman, because it's clearly I will not survive a Haman encounter. Right? Says then, but yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Probably the most famous line in the book. Mordecai's now famous words were sent back to encourage Esther and to prompt her to be faithful and obedient in the position God had placed her in. I don't know why I keep leaving the her off of that. Though God, again, is not acknowledged. Wow. Who knows, Esther, whether you've been brought into the kingdom for such a time as this? Who does the bringing? Who is ordinating and establishing the times and the seasons? And who's not mentioned in the scripture? God. I mean, it's so obvious that something's going on here. And if you recall from last week, we talked about how, like Martin Luther and other theologians of the ancient times or other times have said, Esther doesn't even belong in the Bible. It shouldn't be in the canon. It should not be in Scripture. Never mentions God. Well, you look at it and you go, well, yeah, you can see that somebody said, we're not putting God's name in here, right? Holy Spirit, the author, both, we can see that they are intentionally removing God's name from the text. In terms of every place it should be mentioned, it's clearly not mentioned. So, that's his famous words. Who knows, Esther, whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this? And I imagine that has been repeated by many people through many encouraging words of comfort and prayer and things like that over the centuries since that this has been written. And so, yeah, but obviously God is the orchestrator of all those things in the background. So, number 11. Esther responds back by messenger to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, not the whole empire, but all the Jews who are present here in the city of Shushan, the citadel, and fast for me, neither eating nor drinking for 3 days and 3 nights, again, by Esther, no mention of God. What are they fasting for? Whose attention are they trying to get? What does not eating for 3 days accomplish in the physical world? Okay, no drinking, no eating, no mention of God. Okay, I mean, you get the pattern. Every single place, it seems like he should be given credit, or somebody should be seeking him in prayer, or the outcome of the fasting is to hear from God. That's not what we see revealed to us in the text. So then Esther assures Mordecai that she and her maids will do the same in her house. So Mordecai, out in the city with every Jew he can find, every Jew he knows in the city, they're going to fast, and they are going to fast from food and drink for 3 days. And every woman in the palace, everybody that listens to and obeys Esther, all of her servants, all the people in the women's house, they're also going to gather and fast and seek an outcome favorable for Esther. And so this, then she's going to do it. So it says, after that 3-day fast, I will go into the presence of the king, and she says, but of course, it's still unlawful for me to do it. You still understand this is unlawful. She's reminding him, after 3 days, after all this happens, this can happen. And her famous words, of course, are echoed back, if I perish, I perish, right? And there's, again, more of that attitude of heart. This is a good testimony or statement about following God. If God calls me to do something and I perish, I perish. Better to perish doing the will of the Lord than to perish not doing the will of the Lord or resisting the Lord in some capacity. So she says, I'm willing to accept my consequences. I'm willing to accept these actions. If I perish, I perish. And so we have in chapter 4, we have, I think, the most quoted or most famous lines of the entire book. Who knows, Esther, whether you've come into the kingdom for such a time as this, and okay, I'll go, and if I perish, I perish. That's the kind of the centerpiece of the book in terms of what most people, I think, remember for it. And then Mordecai honored and obeyed Esther's command, setting the stage for the fateful encounter with the king in the following chapter. And so I find it interesting. The chapter opens, or maybe last chapter, it opened with Esther obeying the command of Mordecai not to reveal her Jewish heritage. And this chapter closes with Mordecai obeying Esther's command to fast for 3 days. Right? You see, they're demonstrating a equal, respect and love and understanding of the wisdom and the understanding the position that each of them is in. So here's Esther, she's queen of the empire. And she asks and requests, even commands, that Mordecai fast for her and what's going to happen to her in 3 days. And he obeys. She is also like his daughter, and he commands her not to reveal her Jewish heritage. And she had been, for at least 5 years now, obeying that command, not letting it slip that she is Jewish. So I find it interesting that kind of that bookended parallel between, as the story and the accounts here open, she's obeying his command, and it closes with him obeying her command. Not that the roles have switched, not that, but that they both have different positions, and they both have this, status, and they're both cousins. He's not actually her father or actually her husband, and she's actually the queen, but she's still showing honor, reverence, and respect to the man who brought her up, and the man whose wisdom she believes will help her in all of these situations that she's now facing, even as queen. All right, so that finishes off here, chapter 4. I wanted to take 2 chapters an evening, and so I said these are relatively short, so we're getting out earlier than we often have on our Tuesday nights. But I just want to take 2 chapters tonight. I want to try to open up 3 chapters at a time. So, all right, thanks for everybody for coming. Have a wonderful, blessed evening. See you next week.